Okay, we're back. Nice texting break. Don't you miss texting in class? I feel like this whole semester, it's just been so didn't have many texting breaks. I used to have a lot of those, but now, we're supposed to be so attentive to things. Anyway, thanks for coming, everybody. All right, so Shakespeare in the Bush is probably, it's kind of like if you remember Horace Minor's body ritual among the Nacirema that we read very early on in class. This is one of those articles. It's not quite as famous as the Nacirema, but sometimes it's used outside of anthropology. Sometimes people read it in English classes or something like that. It's kind of a well-read or a famous classic article by the anthropologist Laura Bohannan. And Bohannan was actually trained, she actually was an American anthropologist. She grew up in the United States, but then she did her doctoral training in anthropology in the UK, and then did her field work among the Tiv in Nigeria. And so Bohannan was also kind of obsessed with Shakespeare in a way, and had this idea about Hamlet. And what she believed is something that it's the way we kind of teach Shakespeare in US schools, that it's the sort of universal genius. And what she believed is that, she could translate Shakespeare into another language, because you could understand that Shakespeare was sort of talking about these sort of universal themes, and that if you just made a few translation changes, people in other places could understand them. And so she begins with this idea that, as she says, human nature is pretty much the same the whole world over. So the idea was that Shakespeare was speaking to these kind of deep passions or deep ideas about human nature, and it's pretty much the same, so you'll be able to translate it all over the world. What was interesting, I think, at the very beginning of the story, she has a colleague who's there who's actually English, not American, and the English scholar or English colleague, who's also an academic, said, well, no, you Americans she said Shakespeare was a very English poet, and one can easily misinterpret the universal by misunderstanding the particular. And what I think this person was saying is, in order to understand what Shakespeare is trying to say, it's actually very particular or very specific to what was going on in England at the time. And it's easy to come up with these big universal themes because you don't understand the details of what he was trying to say. And so they were having this argument, and then so she goes off into doing her field work, and there's this whole scene in which she's trying to get stories from them, but there ends up that they need to drink beer together, and they want her to tell this story. And so she sort of gets her chance to see if she can prove her point that they will be able to get the universal morals or the universal ideas of Shakespeare's Hamlet, that she'll be able to translate it into their language. And so she immediately runs into a huge difficulty, as we've talked about, with the whole idea of the ghost. I really like this article, even if you haven't if you've read Hamlet recently. Sometimes you read Hamlet in your senior year of high school. That was kind of something we all did back in the day. But if you've read Hamlet recently, yeah, then it's kind of more apparent, but you don't have to have read Hamlet to get the idea. Hamlet begins with, a scene in which they're talking to a ghost, and she can't translate it. As we talked about, I don't believe in ghosts, but I know what a ghost should be, right? So I have a concept for a ghost, even though I don't believe in it. Whereas in their society, they did not believe that there was an individual personality after death. Now, they did have some ideas about the afterlife and what would happen in the afterlife, but people would not be individual personalities. Now, as Bohannan says, this was something that there were other peoples around in the same region that did have these ideas that would have had a word for it, but in the place where she was, they did not believe in an individual personality after death. One of the serious things that Hamlet is grappling with is that the marriage of his mother after his father dies was too fast. And this is something that causes Hamlet to have all sorts of problems. But in their society, they're like, no, good idea. You should marry if your husband dies, then that's the person that you should marry, is the brother. And so this is something that that is actually called the leveret. For those of you who are up on your Bible, you may remember that they actually tempted Jesus with this idea, which is that, you know, if a woman's husband dies and she marries his brother, and it goes, and so this is sort of a kinship thing where people would have to marry a brother in order to keep the materials in the family. Of course, Jesus famously says, if they are not given in marriage in the kingdom of heaven, and so he sort of gets out of that question. But this is a system of kinship in which it would be a good idea if your husband died to marry the brother, and so they don't think this is a problem at all. This is a great thing. Of course, in European society, they would believe that you should have, you know, only one wife, whereas in their society they would say, well, no, the king needs a lot of wives. That's something that we'll talk about this when we get to kinship and marriage, but, you know, a king should have a number of wives. That's another good thing you could have. And of course, Hamlet's dilemma is all throughout the play is how, if something has happened to his father that was bad, if somebody did it, and should he take revenge, to be or not to be, that kind of thing. And he is grappling with the idea of whether or not he should take revenge or avenge his father. And in their society, they would say, well, the whole central dilemma of Hamlet would be completely would not even exist, because you should not be avenging the death of someone in your father's generation. That should be up to the age mates, or the people who are actually in his father's generation. So if we did Hamlet in that way, then Hamlet would be trying to talk to, I guess, the age mates of his father in order to have them create justice in this situation. But in some ways, the central dilemmas, the central problems of Hamlet are simply disappear in this society and are very difficult to translate. So what's fascinating to me about this, and as one of you said, you know, they start picking the details of this apart, is that in some ways, Bohannan discovers that they are also pretty ethnocentric, in the sense that, or they sort of believe what she believed before she went to the field. So they say, you know, hey, sure, you have some different customs, or your clothes are different, or these things, but people are the same everywhere, which is very much what she thought before she went to the field, that human nature is pretty much the same the world over. And that's what they are telling her, even though she's realizing that they actually are thinking quite differently about the situation they're in. And then in this sort of famous ending, they say, you know, hey, you should tell us more stories, because we will tell you their true meaning, and then you can go back and you can tell your people what they were really supposed to mean. So they are convinced that they are, in fact, in the true and correct in determining the universal aspects of human nature in their interpretation. So in some ways, the thing that she set out with and is kind of starting to disbelieve is exactly what they're telling her, or exactly what they are believing. So what does it show for Bohannan? I think that, as she goes along, what it shows is it's a lot more than just simply swapping different words in for a universal theme. That cultural difference is can be very deep and can cause us to think in very different ways. And so it was a lot deeper than what she was expecting to do. And that to actually appreciate or to, to sort of understand what people are, the patterns that they have is, it's sometimes easy to say that, or it's sometimes easy to believe that in the abstract, but when you're sort of confronted with it, it can actually be very difficult if things are going against some of what you might consider to be your core beliefs, such things as religion or kinship or morality. Um, it's definitely can be a huge challenge. Of course, as we just talked about, their beliefs in a universal human nature, or that they don't believe what Bohannan is coming to believe, that there's this, that culture can provide this deep difference in terms of how people look at and perceive the world. And so Bohannan was a very interesting anthropologist in terms of how she talks about the linkage between words, concepts, ideas, and sort of the what we might consider the reality of the world. So that, we talked about the idea of ghosts, but in this article, she also talks about people saying that people couldn't drown in water because water was only good, or or that people would have the madness or being mad would only come from witches. So these are conceptual ideas. They're not just things that you can say, well, we have the same different words for the same thing. You have to sort of go deeper into the conceptual ideas that underlie both the language and the culture. Now, there's kind of two different ways, two different ways to interpret this story. I think one is sort of the straight up way that Bohannan does, which is, wow, this is a story of mistranslation, of deep difference. But we could also see that, we don't want to, again, fall into that sort of total linguistic determinism, because, in fact, both the Tiv and Bohannan are very interested in storytelling and interpreting the stories of others. So this is something that we could say people share across different cultures. And we could say that, humans are always trying to make meaning of their world. They're always trying to think about the world in symbolic terms. It's almost something that we are compelled to do as human beings. I think, we often see patterns, even though they might be, there's those famous studies where they'll just put up some random dots and people will see patterns in the dots. That's kind of what we do a lot in our lives. We want to know why things are the way they are and to make meaning, and we do that through telling stories. As we talked about, in some ways, both sides are ethnocentric. Both sides believe that their own interpretation is the right or the true way, or that there's one way or one universal way to interpret the story. We could also say that in some ways, both sides have a sense of morality, or both sides have a sense of right and wrong, or who should be married to whom, or who should be avenged for whom. But at the same time, that sense of morality can be quite different. And as we talked about, some of the central dilemmas, some of the central moral dilemmas of Hamlet that Bohannan thought to be universal human nature dilemmas are quite different in another society if you have different kinship patterns, different marriage patterns, and different ideas about how how the world should be. So this is, you know, if you didn't get a chance to read the story, like I said, it's or the article, it's a kind of classic account of taking something from one society and seeing how it works in others and understanding how deeply culture and language shape our perception and our interpretation of the world. How we doing? How we doing? A thumbs up. All right, good. Happy Tuesday, as somebody put it back in the beginning. Oh, Aaliyah, yes, happy Tuesday. Happy